So I just want to say, as you all already know, that one of the reasons that this faculty was brought together for our seminar, these three men, these three dear friends of the project, was because for our theme they were so well suited with their friendship with John Paul II. And I've been sort of assuming that there was a lot of virtue and a lot of humility in them, because I said, well, I know you all don't want to brag about this friendship. And then I think Michael said, well, I'm going to brag about this friendship. But in fact, this is probably a little bit of a front that they're putting on. And in fact, I think they all know what an enormous privilege it is to have had this relationship and to have been drawn into the world of John Paul II. And in my father's case, the friendship with von Hildebrand. And so it is, in fact, a very special thing that they are willing to share these stories with all of you. So I'm so happy that they're willing to do that. Something that Rocco has said before, maybe he'll say it, is that there was this kind of, these concentric circles of friends around Wojtyła, even people who didn't necessarily know each other, but the fact that when they met each other, the fact that they were all friends of Wojtyła sort of made for instant friendship and communion between them. And I've somehow always felt that when I was very young, I had the privilege of meeting John Paul on a few occasions, and my story of John Paul is not really as good as theirs, because I'll tell it quickly, because everything else is uphill from here. I was, I don't know how old I was. Yeah. 5? Okay, so it was about 5. So note the age, all right? And your phone is ringing, so, okay. Just turn it off. So, I was about 5, and we were at one of John Paul II's morning masses, and my mother was holding me. And by the way, I don't remember this, so that's a further excuse here. And after communion, John Paul was wont to remain in prayer, contemplation for sometimes long periods of time. So that added some time. And apparently, I didn't see the beauty in all of this. And at that moment, I said very loudly to my mother in German, I said, "Wann ist die Messe aus? When will Mass be over?" And my mother said she just wanted to melt into the ground. And just at that moment, and I have to say, John Paul faced the altar, so he wasn't looking at the small congregation there, but he turned around and he gave her a smile, as if to say, "I understand. It really is rather long." So he reassured her. So that's where I stood with John Paul II. That's probably why he didn't keep me in his inner circle. So on that rather modest basis, I'm going to turn it over to Rocco, who's going to take us to new heights. So.
Well, I think that John Henry has already said what is most important. I shall repeat it. First, John Paul II was a friend. He was my friend, yes. You invited me here because you think he was my friend, and yes, he was my friend. But you know this. But what you do not know is that he was your friend. I mean, he was a man who had a tremendous respect and love for every human being, and who could give his life, really, for any human being because of a reverence in front of the absolute preciousness and dignity of each human person. I have been with him for a long time. We have dined and discussed and worked. But when he comes back in my dreams, as he sometimes does, what I remember is the first time I saw him. I was a boy, your age, perhaps even younger than some of you, a little bit older than others. And he passed by, he gave me his hand, he watched me in my eyes, and I immediately felt, this is a man who would give his life for you, if need be. And this is what millions of people have experienced when they met him. He had friends, and his friends had friends. He knew how to be a friend. And his friends also had friends, and they talked to their friends about him. So that a lot of people got to think that they were his friends before they knew him. I remember, perhaps it is the end of the 60s. It might have been 1967. I was a friend of one of his friends, and this friend was Don Francesco Ricci. Don Francesco Ricci was an extraordinary Italian priest who was a professional smuggler, and I was his assistant. I was 19. We smuggled books. We smuggled books into the communist countries. And through this activity, by the way, we smuggled 50,000 Bibles, among other things. I very little, but altogether, it was called the Bible of the Millennium for the 1,000 years of the baptism of Paul. And he talked to Wojtyła about his friends, and he talked to us about Wojtyła. And we started entering into the sphere of the spiritual influence of Wojtyła much before we met him. I was in the movement of Comunione Liberazione, perhaps you know this movement. No, Comunione Liberazione did not exist. It was Gioventù Studentesca. Gioventù Studentesca are the forefathers of Comunione Liberazione. Before Comunione Liberazione, there was Gioventù Studentesca. And we went to the pilgrimage to Częstochowa. And we had a Polish movement with whom we had very good relations. We were brothers. It was called Światło Życie, Light and Life, of a great Polish priest, a great friend of Wojtyła, of course, Father Franciszek Blachnicki. And they had a few houses, a kind of small village in Krosienko. After the pilgrimage, we used to go to Krosienko. And the legend says, I do not guarantee that it is true, but because, well, I do not guarantee that it is true, but the legend says that one day Wojtyła passed by and passed by the small church of Krosienko. And he heard some people singing in the church, and he stopped. Who are they? And they sang in a language that was a strange language. It was clearly a Slavic language, but Wojtyła did not know it. Wojtyła had studied Slavic philology at the Jagiellonian University, and he thought he knew all Slavic languages. And this was a Slavic language he did not know. And he said to Jewish, what are they? Perhaps Lusatian Serbians, a very tiny Slavic minority in Eastern Germany. Let us go and see. He entered and discovered that they were Italians who sang in what they thought was Polish. That is the first time that we met Cardinal Wojtyła. Well, and he was so amused about it. And then a friendship started. For a long time, I was just a boy who, at some occasions, who felt he was his friend because we were in this environment. There is also a typical Polish word that is środowisko, that means environment. And this is also the way in which Wojtyła governed his diocese, through friends. Friends who made friends so that in some way everybody was incorporated into this friendship. And it was clear that the basis of this friendship was the presence of Jesus Christ. The presence of Jesus Christ in his life, and through him in our lives, or in the life of all of his friends. Later, Ricci insisted in compelling me to write a book on Wojtyła. I did not want, but he was convinced that this was a very important philosopher, and nobody in the West knew him. And you have to. I was a young philosopher, and he compelled me to write this book. And I made a first version of the book using some translations that I could find. And he read it, and he said, "Now, you've got to learn Polish. You cannot do this if you do not read the original." I could speak a few words of Polish, but and I rewrote the book. In the meantime, Wojtyła became Pope. He was elected. It was incredible. The day when he was elected, we could not believe it. You must know that in Poland, many years ago, in 1831, there was a great uprising against the Russians who had occupied Poland. It was the time of the partitions of Poland. Well, the Pope betrayed Poland, condemned the uprising, and defended the legitimate rights of the Russian Tsar, who was persecuting the Catholic Church. He did it for his good reasons. We are not making a class history, no, an history class, but he did it. And in any other country, you could have had an apostasy of the nation. On the contrary, in Poland, you had a great poet, Julius Słowacki. He wrote a poem prophesying that one day a Polish pope would come to make justice to the Polish nation. And he says, a great bell rings in the halls of the world. Listen, the Slavic Pope is coming. He will be a brother of the people. When he was elected in the places, in the streets in Poland, everybody sang the words of Słowacki, the Slavic Pope. He came. He invited. He used to talk to intellectuals, to distinguished philosophers, economists. He invited them in his Archbishop's palace in Krakow. And when he came to Rome, he did the same. And he invited me. I suppose this was the first time that he became conscious of me. I was conscious of him since 12 years, but that was the first time he became conscious that I existed. No, not quite, because Richie told him that I was writing a book on him, but he became conscious of what my face was. As I say. He knew about me, but I don't think he remembered my face. And then we became friends. It is impressive what John Harrier said, because I wanted to tell you a very similar story. One day I was having at the mass with him, with my family, and there was also Chiara, my third daughter. And after a while, after the mass, he had spent an enormous time with his action of grace, and it was too much for Chiara. And she started becoming restless. And I was just ready, having lifted up my hand, to give her a small slap on the neck. And then he must have had 4 eyes, 2 in front, 2 on the neck, because he turned towards us, he made to me like this. Then he blessed us and let us go. He was a man who had a great sense of humor. I remember many occasions in which we were sitting with a lot of important professors or cardinals discussing important issues, everybody very self-conscious. And he listened like this, with the head leaning on the hand, and he laughed with his eyes. And if you knew him, you could read in his eyes what he was thinking. You know, you have been there sometimes. And in the end, he said only very few words, but very penetrating, catching the essence of the question with a keen sense of humor, but also very respectful of all persons, with a great hope for each one of those who were there. And you always went out hoping to be able to justify the confidence he had in you, the hope he had on you as a person. As I told you, he was now. I don't remember now the name of. It was the last secretary of John Paul II, that young Polish priest. No, not Jewish. Jewish is the old one. It was a young one. He has written a book on John Paul II, on the humor of John Paul II. I've been looking for this book. I never found it. But he was a man of humor. I remember once he had gone to Africa, and he had gone from one city to the other, visiting sometimes two capitals in one day, with 12, 15, 20 gatherings in one day. And my sister, who was a prominent journalist, a prominent TV journalist, had accompanied him with the troupe of the Italian TV. And when she came back, she's the eldest sister, she called me and she told me, you must go to the Holy Father, you must tell him, Holy Father, you cannot do this, you will destroy your health, nobody can live in this way. My sister, who was a very strong Italian woman, came back absolutely destroyed from this voyage, and she did not visit all the cities you did. And I was very obedient. I went to him and I told him all what I had to do. And I knew that in the end there must have been something very, very, well, a very surprising response, because he was looking, and the more he listened, the more he was amused. And then he said, Africa? Did Africa damage my health? Africa rejuvenated me. I feel much younger. It is the curia that kills me. That is the way he was. I remember dramatic moments. But he was so human. There are many saints. Nobody had a doubt that he was a saint. We never thought he could become a pope. Yes, that's true. But we had no doubt that he would become a saint, or that he was a saint. But he was a saint that was human. There are great saints I admire, I pray to, but I would not like to become like them. Also because I do not know how I could start to become like them. But it was impossible to stand near to him and not to feel the desire to be like them. He was a man of great prayer. I remember once in Castel Gandolfo, in the summer, he used to have meetings with prominent intellectuals, philosophers, sociologists, to discuss important issues of the world of today. And I remember that once, after the Mass, I went lost. I often do. Philosophers are made that way. And I opened one door looking for the way to the conference room. I opened one door and I enter and I find the Pope alone, kneeling in the center of the room. It was a room, a kind of warehouse with different materials, kneeling and praying. And I tried to make myself as small as possible and to get out, closing the door without making noise. And I asked myself, what kind of man is this who, when he has one free moment, he kneels down wherever he is and prays? And well, I remember December 13, 1981, when there was in Poland the state strike. In one day, 60,000 people disappeared. They were seized by the secret police, brought to jail, or in concentration camps. And I remember, and we had no news about them. I went around trying to make contacts. It was impossible. And the hardliners of the party wanted to have them executed. Perhaps not all 60,000, but surely Wałęsa and the other leaders of Solidarność. And I spent a dramatic night in the Cappellette in Rome, you know, Michael, in Santa Maria Maggiore, near Santa Maria Maggiore, with Bohdan Civilski. Bohdan was the second in command of Solidarność, but he was in Rome and he had come to visit the Pope, and he could not go back, of course. And he told me, well, now there will be the uprising. It is a Polish tradition, that of uprisings. Desperate uprisings without any hope of success, just to say to the world, we exist, we are a nation, we have the right to live free. There will be the uprising, and then the Red Army will come. They will kill 1 million Poles, and but what else can we do? That was the atmosphere. And then the following day, John Paul II, for the Angelus, appears in that window in St. Peter, and he says, too much Polish blood has been poured in this century through Polish hands. Enough. No problem of the nation will be solved through blood. Dialogue can save the Polish nation. Only dialogue can save the Polish nation. And everybody understood that he did not want the uprising, the insurrection, and that he demanded of Jaruzelski was the Polish dictator, not to kill the prisoners. The insurrection had already begun in Katowice, in the carbon mines, with extreme violence, and it was stopped. And it began a period of 8 years in which the nation and the church struggled to give witness to truth without making use of violence, rejecting the use of violence. And in the end, the regime fell. They went down. I remember when John Paul II went to Prague, after Warsaw, after Poland, they went down in the Czech Republic, in Hungary, everywhere. And I remember John Paul II going there and meeting Václav Havel, a great playwright who was the president of the Republic. They took him out of jail and brought him to be president of the Czechoslovakian Republic. And Havel said, Holy Father, I don't know whether I believe in miracles. He was near to Christian faith, but he was not a believer. I do not know whether I believe in miracles, but if there are miracles, today we are witnesses not of one miracle, but of two. The first miracle is that you are landing here to visit Czechoslovakia. The second miracle is that the President of the Republic who gives you the welcome speech, that's me. And, then there was the second part of his pontificate. You cannot imagine what was Europe then, because communism had suppressed the hatred of one nation against another. And there was an enormous demand of revenge for all the blood that had been poured through the communist dictatorships. And the most likely thing was a civil war in all the space extending from the Baltic up to the Adriatic. By the way, a space in which there were an enormous quantity of nuclear weapons. And he succeeded in, catalyzing the energies of the people towards reconstruction, towards um, forgiveness, reconciliation. And perhaps it was not a miracle that communism fell, because it was so inhuman that sooner or later had to fall. But it is a miracle that it could fall without blood, without war. And the second part of the pontificate was dedicated to the struggle for the soul of the West against the dictatorship of moral relativism. And most people think it is a lost struggle. How can it succeed? They've already won. And I remember, perhaps they're right, but I remember that in the 70s, in the 80s, when he arrived, nobody would have believed that communism could fall. Everybody was convinced in Europe that communism was the future. And I remember one day, in one of these meetings, we discussed, well, what will happen now? It was in the beginning of the movement of Solidarność. Will communism collapse? Will communism remain? I said it would collapse. And they listened to us, and in the end he said, well, thank you, very penetrating insights. Anyway, if communism collapses tomorrow, what is our task? A moment of silence, nobody knew what to say. And then he continued, our task is to evangelize. And if communism is bound to fall in 1,000 years, because sooner or later it will fall, but we do not know when, what is our task? To evangelize. Then let us concentrate our attention on giving witness, and God will take care of the rest. And so I think that is good for us too now. Take care of giving witness, and God will take care of the rest. Then came the last years. I remember, well, he suffered, but he never stopped smiling. No, you remember, he never stopped smiling. And he was full of faith and hope. When he died, I was invited by the German television to comment on the event. And there was a group of, there was a theologian. The theologian was a very famous professor, who, by the way, was no more a theologian, no more a priest. He had become a psychoanalyst. And he explained that, oh, well, this Pope it does not make, it's nothing new. It is just a media phenomenon. Look, yes, it is true. Millions of young people went to the youth days. But did they read his encyclicals? Did they act according to his moral precepts in the field of sexuality? No, they didn't. And I said, look, first of all, it is not enough to have been a bad priest to become a good psychoanalyst. Then I can imagine that most of the young people that went to Rome to Tor Vergata for the youth day, did not read his books or his encyclicals. I imagine that that the majority of them tried to live up to Christian sexual morality, sometimes succeeding, sometimes not succeeding, falling and beginning again. But the reason why they went there is because they felt that he loved them, that he was ready to give his life for them. And when you find a life like this, a love like this in a man who is not your father, is not your mother, not even your spouse, your wife, or your husband, at least the doubt, not the certainty, the doubt that this love might have a supernatural root, at least this doubt must remain with you. And I am sure that all those who met him have remained with this doubt. And this doubt in many has matured with time, it has become faith. And in others, well, it did not mature yet, but perhaps it will. He was a man of God.
Before I begin, I would like to ask you a question, if I might. This may be legend, but I'd always heard that you had gone to Poland to study phenomenology,
I did.
and that you were in Poland, and that's where you met Wojtyła.
Not quite. I went in Poland to study phenomenology. I went in Poland to study phenomenology because somehow I had already met Wojtyła, in the sense that I was compelled by Ricci to go to Poland because he wanted me to write the book on Wojtyła.
I prefer the legend. When Pope John Paul II was elected, it was startling. And I was stunned by the fact that a Polish Pope, whose mother was rumored to be Slovak, we claim everybody shamelessly, and I immediately felt a sense of kinship with him. And later on, well, I won't go on, but I just so, wow. And he was a man of Carmelite spirituality, as George Weigel says. St. John of the Cross made such an impact on him. And I responded to that. And his humor, his handsome looks, his athletic prowess, he was just extraordinary. When he came to Washington, I invited my mother down from Pennsylvania. And we went to hear him, and after Mass, at St. Matthew's, the Cathedral of Washington, where John Kennedy was buried from, he appeared after a few moments on the balcony of the bishop's residence next door. And when it was plain that he was coming out, and maybe when he appeared, the whole crowd started to chant, John Paul II, we love you. And it went on and on. At a certain moment, the Pope raised his hand and said, John Paul II, he loves you. It was just so wonderful. It's just so wonderful. And okay, then I had a chance to There was the wealthiest man in North America is a Slovak man, Steve Roman, who happened to buy a lot of property outside of Toronto, under which is buried most of the uranium of the world. So he dealt mostly with heads of state, but through the Slovak circles, he invited me to come with him to the blessing of a Slovak cathedral in Basilica in Toronto. And so I went to that, and in the receiving line, I had a chance to meet him. And again, I can't tell you how moving that was. I dedicated to him my book called The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, because there were 10,000 books on the transition from capitalism to socialism, and there wasn't a single book on the reverse. And I thought I owed it to my family in Central Europe and my heritage to help people start thinking about that transition. And what do you aim at? And I'd been spurred into it in part by a Polish intellectual he was in America studying for a year. And he kept probing me on Madison. He loved James Madison and the meaning of the American founding. And what is the United States? And there isn't a book to explain it, he said, and it's true. There are political books, but they don't pay much attention to the economics. There are economics books, they don't pay much attention to the politics or humanities. And there are humanities studies which are always quoting and quarreling with one another's footnotes. They don't deal with the larger questions. And I thought, you can't understand the free society unless you understand there are three liberties. Political liberty, well, first cultural liberty, liberty of conscience, liberty of the arts, liberty of speech, liberty of science. And then there has to be a political liberty, protecting speech and the rest. And then there has to be culture. Okay. So one day, after the publication of the book, a young man comes to my office, tall, thin, and he's looking over both shoulders. It was rumored about me in Central Europe I was CIA because they were trying to destroy my reputation. And he said he's from Solidarność. And he's there. They want to publish Spirit of Democratic Capitalism underground in Poland, which was a dream come true. And he said, we need to know if we can have your permission. And I said, well, of course you can. But I said, I must charge you royalties. And his face fell. And I said, well, here are the royalties. First, you must send a copy to me. Then you must send a copy to the Pope. And he said, he smiled, he relaxed, and he said, the second will be easy. He said the first will take a little longer. And it did take a little longer. It's still my most precious possession. But, okay. So, I wrote essays trying to interpret for Americans the teaching of each of his encyclicals in turn. And they weren't greeted with great warmth on the whole, but with lots of suspicion. And, okay, I mean, they became known at the Vatican and so forth. And so we knew a little bit. Then a bunch of the American bishops were very upset at me because I had organized a group of lay people to write I'm the only layman in history who's written 2 pastoral letters. It's true. And one on nuclear policy. And I was very afraid of what the Catholic bishops were recommending. I'm not going to go into the details. But I thought that's not the bishop's territory. They're judging tactics and strategy, and we consult military people for that. Yes, there are moral questions, you can raise those. But you need to know also the political implications of it. Well, and anyway, lay people should, this is lay expertise, and we got great generals and the head of the CIA at the time. Walter Vernon was Catholic, and General Rowney, Polish American, was Catholic and very much on top of these issues. And they were scared, said, well, anyway, we wrote a letter in 3 drafts after wide consultation. And I took it, I called the delegate to the US, and Vatican delegate, and asked him for a meeting. And I told him what we were doing. I said, I want you to know we're writing this letter. It's lay people. But we're not opposed to the bishops or the Pope. We don't know what the bishops are going to say. Their letter isn't out yet. We only see the articles about it in the paper. So I want you to know we're not opposed to the bishops, but we do think this is a lay responsibility, and we should do it. If we don't do it, it's our fault. And he said, oh, they're having a big discussion tomorrow, 2 days from now in the Vatican. Could you get me a copy by tomorrow? Could you get me 3 copies? So we hurried up and polished it and sent it down to him, and he put them in the overnight express to the Vatican. Well, I heard later that they came just in time because, one, there was a group of the American bishops there, and they were explaining their views, and the Vatican was not at all happy with what they were saying. Thought it was a great threat to Europe. And the French bishops were talking about a letter in France to the French bishops. And they were thrilled to receive our draft, and they adapted it practically as the French draft. Well, some of the American bishops were very happy. Cardinal O'Connor was very happy. I sent it to him first of all. But there were a bunch of others who were a little bit sore at me, and tried to undermine me. And well, okay. Pardon? No names. No names. Although my wife has promised to punish them. Women are much less forgiving. And, okay. She said the last thing that will die in her is her grudges. And that's what you call a loving wife, huh? Okay. So the next thing I know, and then I started a seminar in Washington at the American Enterprise Institute 10 years before Centesimus Annus, because we knew there would be a encyclical marking the 100th year of Leo XIII. So I convened a lot of clergy and theologians and economists and others to say, if you were asked to contribute to this letter, what would you say? Let's think ahead on this and prepare. So we were preparing for Centesimus Annus and for 10 years in advance. And then when the letter came out, when Centesimus Annus came out, the Vatican sent 2 copies of it to me. And somebody from the Vatican called and said, have you received it? I said, no. Well, they sent one through the American bishops, and it never reached me. But they did send another to the American ambassador in Rome, and I called them. I hadn't received it, and they did have it. And the American ambassador, I won't mention his name either, said that there's nothing to it, it's old stuff. So I asked to talk to his wife, who was much smarter than he was. And I said, Margaret, could you give me the highlights of the letter? I said, I want to know 3 things, and I named them. So she looked them up right away, and she said, yes. She said, let me read you this. And so she did, and I like that. And okay, the next year I'm invited to a meeting in Italy, Foligno, and it's on the birth of civic society in Italy. And what is the name of the Antoninus? I can't remember his name of Foligno. Anyway, um, I'm sitting at dinner. I usually stayed with the American ambassador because I was sort of active in helping to promote the idea of an American ambassador to the Vatican again after an absence of 30 years. And while we were at dinner, the phone rings and it's a message from the Vatican to, can I come to dinner the next evening? And here's the way you come, go to this gate and you'll be met and bring me up. And so I am just overawed and thrilled with this. I had not really met the Pope except that shaking hands. And so Zivish welcomes me. Well, first of all, you walk up all the stairs. And I had a young Swiss guard. He was not heaving a breath at all. And I had to stop every 20 steps and just catch my breath and go up. But he led me down to the room, the dining room, and we went in. It was like having dinner with my grandfather. I mean, it was very plain, very simple, very Eastern European, a soup. There was a pasta in a bow of respect. When Rome do as the Romans do. And then a veal, and very simple. And it was just like old home for me. But Zivish tells me, the Pope's secretary, whom I just met then, that Rocco Buttiglione is coming. So I thought, I owe this to Rocco. How on earth am I here except through Rocco? So all during the meal, I was singing your praises in my heart. And I remember being so awestruck that I hardly said a word. I didn't think I should waste the Pope's time or anything. And I was dying to ask him all kinds of things, but I couldn't. And then at one time I had to speak, and I said, Holy Father, I can't thank you enough for the great miracle of bringing down the wall. And he looked at me with rather complete disdain and said to me, that was no miracle. And he said something, I can't remember the exact words because he was speaking in Italian. We were going between Italian and English. And he said something like, what I remember is, that was such a Mickey Mouse system. It was bound to fall of itself. That was no miracle. But I learned from watching Rocco and the others that what you must do when you come to visit at least John Paul is you must come with a good joke. So when I had dinner or lunch with him after that, or even Mass, I always came with a good joke for him. I'll tell you one of them. One of them was 4 years after the victory of Solidarność, which was a few years later. Well, no, it was before Centesimus Annus. It was a few years after my book came out. I said, Holy Father, there's a joke being told about you in America, and I don't know if it's true or not, but it's a good joke. And I said, the joke is that when you heard that in the new election, there are 38 political parties in Poland, one of them attracting the most attention is the beer drinkers party. And when you heard this, you were disappointed, and you said, there are only 2 solutions to the Polish crisis: the miraculous solution and the realistic solution. He said did he put it? Oh, the miraculous solution will be if the Lady of Czestochowa appears before the... Yeah. Oh, yeah, I got it backwards. You know the story. You were there. But I got the story back. The realistic solution is if Our Lady of Czestochowa should suddenly appear at the head of the Polish nation with Jesus and all the saints on his right hand and Moses and all the prophets on the other hand. That's the only realistic solution. The miraculous solution is if the Poles learn to compromise and cooperate. That was a big hit in Poland, and he loved it. Okay. I want to just reinforce something that Rocco said. To be at Mass with him, he would be there before you came. Little chapel, 15 people, 20 at most. And he would be hunched over his prie-dieu in such a deep, let me say, well, I don't want to say it that way, but let me say he was wrapped in prayer. He was just enshrouded in the presence of the Lord. I mean, you never saw, even in the Vatican, even the Curia people who didn't like him thought of him as a saint and a mystic. Now, in Rome, they're very used to popes. There's a saying that popes come and go. The Curia lives forever. So I remember one cardinal I met when I was in the seminary there years before, who explained to me that he prayed every day. This was Pius XII. That Pius XII goes speedily to his profoundest hope of eternal life and be with God. And he said, it's all right to pray for that. I'm just praying for what he hopes for and what he prays for. Even, I hope he dies soon is what he really meant. Okay. You have to understand Rome a little bit. But it was just unforgettable to see the Pope in prayer. He was just in another world. And yet he was immediately present to everybody who was there too. One of my friends is a Swiss guard, friends I met since, and he was the tallest of the Swiss guards and the strongest, so he was the protector of the Pope. He always followed the Pope. And one day the Pope excused himself on his way to his bedroom, and my friend was accompanying him. And he said, excuse me for a minute, I want to say a night prayer. And he went in, and he was there lying on the ground. He was there for an hour. And my friend began to worry that he was not keeping his responsibilities, so he opened the door. And there he was prostrate, just in a totally, as I don't want to say as in a trance, it'll give me the wrong idea, but in another presence. So he gently closed the door. He was sorry he'd made some noise opening it. And he went back an hour later. I mean, stayed outside the door, but he opened the door an hour later. And this time the Pope turned and smiled to him. And then as he came out, he said, was that you a while ago that opened the door? And he said, yes. He said, well, if I keep you waiting like that again, come in and interrupt me. Well, you really wouldn't dare. But I just want to underline, he was in another world so often, just with the Lord. You could feel it, tangibly feel it. And then I'll stop on one last note. The Pope really liked Karen. It's no wonder everybody did. I mean, Tamir was to love her, but let me just cite a couple of things. She did a corpus for a processional cross for a church in Michigan, cast in bronze, with an extremely curved back. because she'd done a lot of reading on the crucifixion, and she learned that most of those crucified died by asphyxiation. They could hold themselves erect for so long, but then they couldn't, and their lungs would collapse. It's the most extraordinary figure. And she brought one to Rome to present to John Paul II. So after Mass, Gibish said, go to the end of the line, because the Pope always went around the table and greeted everybody after Mass. There'd be newly ordained priests, and families from Peru and so forth, visiting from all over the world. And so we went to the end of the line, and at the very end, the Pope had more time, and he spent time, and Karen presented him with the corpus. And he said instantly, at the very instant of death, and Karen said, quick as a flash, without reflection at all, with pure Holy Spirit, she said, crossing the threshold of hope, which was the name of his most recent book. And he just burst into a big grin. But toward the end, when the Parkinson's really affected him, he didn't smile. He couldn't. His face was sort of frozen. I mean, he didn't have control of it. But every time he saw Karen, he would break into a big smile. It happened more than once. One time, he invited our Krakow group to attend the millennium with him. Can you believe it? I think it was the very first day of the millennium, but somebody told me they have it in their diary, it was the third day. No matter, it was... and so we were about 70 alumni, and young people all, obviously, except the faculty. And Karen and I were standing toward the back to give the young people more. But it just so happened we were in the line of vision of the corridor, not the corridor we all came in, but another corridor, down which the Pope was brought. And he caught the eye of both of us from a little distance and just broke immediately into a grin. And his face just relaxed. I saw that 2 or 3 different times. One last story about this. There were 2 married couples, recently married couples in our midst, one of them in bridal gown, and because they were just been married, 2 Americans. And the Pope gave a special blessing to them. He blessed everybody in the group. They all came up for a blessing. We sang a song in Polish for him, Polish Christmas song. Badly, but most of the people were Polish, and he was just so thrilled that we learned it, especially the clumsy Americans. But he took time to bless everybody and say a few words. So the married couples he blessed with special fervor. And then one of my former students from the Krakow seminar, who had been 20 years old when she was at the seminar from University of Pennsylvania, her life was sort of converted by the experience of Krakow, especially Auschwitz. Anyway, she married just a few months before, a year before this meeting, and she was 8 months pregnant. I mean, she was tense-like. And so when they came up for a blessing, by the way, she teaches at Ave Maria now, and this young son is a young lad, and he's come up to do us a couple of favors at our house. And he's heard this story and he's very proud of it. But anyway, the Pope blesses the married couple, and then he pauses a moment. Then he leans down and blesses the child in the womb. It was just so immensely touching. It was just so beautiful and so perfect. Okay, I hope said enough to suggest what an enormous privilege it was to know him at all. And I'm going to brag. After the first visit, we got a call from Gibish, or I did, that any time we came to Rome, write in advance or call when we were in Rome. And if the Pope had room, on his schedule, he'd invite us in. What an extraordinary thing to do. So we did, and it was amazing to find out they answered. They knew who I was. They were ready. They had been prompted. And if it were workable, there'd be mass or lunch or dinner. So I gave credit to Rocco for all this all those years. And Rocco can tell you that was not, I believe in the legend. He can tell you the truth. But you knew you were in the company of a saint. Santo subito, everybody shouted at the canonization. And by the way, one last thing. I went at the invitation of President Bush, and I flew in the presidential plane to the funeral because he had special access to the body in wake the night before. And we went immediately to St. Peter's, the whole party. And there were 3 presidents, Bush's and Clinton. Carter wouldn't come, and or couldn't. And I mean, that was the greatest favor I could have imagined, was to go there to the funeral. But the next day at the ceremony, at the funeral, you know, they all chanted, especially the Polish section, Santo subito, make him a saint as soon as possible. Well, what they really meant, he is already a saint, recognize him as soon as possible. It was the greatest example of canonization by acclamation that maybe the Vatican has ever seen. But the book of the Gospels was open on a table, and at a very silent moment of the Mass, the pages started to blow. It was like the breath of the Holy Spirit. Everybody felt it. But there was one other thing that not very many people observed, and it was that it was very cloudy all day, gray. A little bit of sun in the background, but it didn't come out. So in the photographs of the event, there are no shadows because there's not enough sun. But at the moment the pallbearers lifted the casket, this light pine wood casket, the sun came out. And I told a number of people that, and Bush saw it and I saw it, but they denied it. So I went and I spent 3 hours in the Osservatorio Romano library of photographs and asked for all the photographs of the event. And by God, there it is. At that moment, you can see the shadows of the pallbearers and the shadows of the casket. You couldn't before, but as they carried the casket into St. Peter's, the sun was shining. I mean, I don't believe in miracles, but if it was, I don't. I mean, but the Lord is so great and so providential, and He can arrange that these things happen for natural causes. You know, He doesn't have to intervene. The sun does break out of clouds sometimes, and the timing was perfect. That's all I'll say. The timing was perfect. Okay, sorry, I'm good.
I had left a good story for Michael. He did not tell it, so I sheltered it. Michael was a rather controversial figure in the Vatican. He had many friends, and also a few bishops who were not overtly friendly. and there was a meeting to discuss about this Michael Novak. And there were different opinions. And so the Holy Father asked me, well, try to read, make some research, then we meet again. And we met again. And I presented saying, well, one could say this, but could say also that, and there were others who made their intervention, presenting opinions, I must say, in the majority, not very favorable. And in the end, the Holy Father listened, as usual. And in the end, he said, well, Michael Novak, it is a Slovakian name. It cannot be thoroughly bad.
I'll say a few things about my friendship with Dietrich von Hildebrand, but perhaps first something on John Paul, and in particular something that illustrates the wonderful humor of the man. I had an opportunity again and again between about 1983 and 92 to meet with John Paul. Almost every year I was teaching a short course at the Institute for the Family in Rome that he had founded, and he favored the faculty of this Institute for the Family, and when we were in Rome, even just coming to teach a course for a week, there was an open door for us with the Holy Father. And so once when I went and taught my course and had this wonderful encounter usually over breakfast with the Holy Father, my wife, who has a great devotion to Saint Therese of Lisieux, gave me a letter for the Holy Father. And it was a letter in which she proposed to the Holy Father that he canonize Saint Therese and declare her a doctor of the Church. And so my wife, out of this tremendous veneration for Saint Therese, wanted to convey directly to the Holy Father this message. This was maybe 92 or 91. And so I present the letter to the Holy Father. He immediately opens it and reads it while I stand there, and he gets this mischievous look on his face. He says, I see that Professor Crosby has a very devout wife. But, he said, I wonder, is Professor Crosby himself very devout at all? And so it was a moment, a delightful moment of being the object of the playful humor of John Paul. And I do, among other things, remember the time we were in Castel Gandolfo. It may have been the time when you had that experience of finding him in prayer, but
You were there also.
in 91, I think it was, yeah. We were there. It was for 2 days. We took all our meals with the Holy Father and prayed, and the Poles in the group sang Polish songs to the Pope at night. Although one of the Poles, I remember, told me that he had to edit the words of the song. He said the real words would not be fit for the ears of the Holy Father. But it was centered around issues of moral theology, and each of us were supposed to make about a 20-minute presentation, and then there would be a discussion around that presentation. There were maybe 10 participants there. And I remember the moment when it was my turn to give my presentation vis-a-vis the Holy Father. And I thought to myself, what am I doing here? Lecturing to the Pope about, my subject was the contingency of the human person and what that implies for the moral life. But to my great relief, when I gave my presentation, John Paul was praying his office. So I was almost relieved that I did not have the undivided attention of the Pope as I spoke. But it was
But you couldn't listen.
That's true, yes. I could tell from subsequent remarks that he had heard everything of importance in what I had said. So, the other particularly memorable thing about those days together with John Paul was how much he listened. You know, at meals, he didn't take the lead and assert himself and dominate the discussion, but he drew you out and asked you, and he listened. And that capacity for quiet, respectful listening struck me again and again when I was able to meet with him. So uh, that's John Paul, but you've heard a great deal from Michael and Rocco. Maybe just a few remembrances from my friendship with Dietrich von Hildebrand. I'm the only one here who knew him personally. And so let me just pick out a few things and one point in particular that will interest you all and interest Michael Novak in particular. But let me start with my very first meeting with Dietrich von Hildebrand. I was a young undergraduate at Georgetown University, and I had been instrumental in inviting von Hildebrand to come. I had begun reading some of his works, and when I had a chance to put his name forward for a distinguished lecture, I was only glad to do it. So he came to Georgetown for a major public lecture, and I was the one delegated to pick him up at the airport in Washington. And I went early to the old Washington National Airport as it existed in 1966, and went to the meeting place. No Dietrich von Hildebrand, no Alice von Hildebrand. The plane was in. I waited. I called back to Georgetown University and was told, Alice von Hildebrand just called. She's very upset that you haven't picked them up yet. She says they're going back to New York if you don't pick them up. I wait, and I still don't find them. And in my desperation, I eventually figure out that in the Washington National Airport, at that time, there were a number of newsstands of the same name. So the one at which we were to meet had the same name as several others. So eventually, I cracked that riddle and found von Hildebrand, and I approached him with a lot of trepidation, thinking, this is a famous elderly man. His wife is already upset at me. I've made him wait for maybe 2 hours. And I really expected, a scowl. And, I recognized him from the picture. I went up and greeted him. And unforgettable is the gladness with which he stood up and greeted me, as if I hadn't made him wait at all. It was as if the whole inconvenience of the thing counted for nothing. Now he and I had found each other, and we met, and it was as if I was some dear old friend with whom he was reunited. And so that first impression of somehow setting aside all the natural irritation that one might feel, and that human warmth, that unfeigned, overflowing warmth of the man, that was what first.
Yeah, but Lily told me she still has a grudge.
Yes, that's another story. She's just like your wife Karen, whose grudges don't die so quickly. So he came to Georgetown to give a lecture that was entitled, this was now in February '66, so about 3 months after the close of Vatican II. And he gave a lecture entitled The True Meaning of Aggiornamento. And it was, as it turned out, a kind of first draft of his well-known book, The Trojan Horse in the City of God. And the experience of him delivering that lecture is absolutely unforgettable to me. He spoke with such an ardent love of the church, and with such distress at what he saw, especially as the desecration of the liturgy. But the religious passion and zeal with which he spoke made a tremendous impression on me, because it was not just as a great thinker and philosopher, which he was, and which you could detect in his presentation, but it was as a great religious personality, bearing witness. That's what caught my imagination. And it was something new. You know, I had a lot of impressive professors and European intellectuals. They came through all the time at Georgetown, but I had never seen this ardor of Catholic faith. I thought to myself, this is not a professor, this is a confessor. That's the spirit in which he spoke, and that opened, as it were, a new world for me. And I was aware at the time something new is breaking into my life at this moment. A new direction will be taken now in my life. Things won't be the same anymore after this encounter with Dietrich von Hildebrand. And in fact, very soon after we did become friends, he invited me to New York, and then soon after to Florence, where he spent his summers in the home where he had been born, in Vienna. So a real friendship and a kind of philosophical discipleship situated in that friendship developed. I never took a formal class with him, but he was my teacher in this way over a period of about 11 years, in this manner of a kind of personal discipleship based on deep veneration and mutual friendship as well.